My name is Sadie. I sat in my Boston apartment, staring at a cheap chocolate cupcake. The clock struck 8, my 30th birthday, completely forgotten. Margaret and Samuel were too busy celebrating Jackson's new clinic opening. A memory surfaced. I was 12, standing in a blizzard for 4 hours, clutching a coding trophy. They never came. Jackson had a slight fever. That night, the coldness finally took root. Tell me I am not the only one who has felt this invisible. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? I did not cry. My emotional bandwidth for Margaret and Samuel had depleted somewhere around my sophomore year of college. Instead of weeping over the unlit candle on my pathetic little cupcake, I opened my laptop. The screen glowed in the dim room, illuminating my face. I logged into my primary brokerage account. For the last 8 years, I had built my life quietly and meticulously. Margaret and Samuel thought I was just some low-level help desk worker fixing printers. They never bothered to ask what a lead software engineer actually did. They certainly did not know about the tech startup I had joined 5 years ago, nor did they know about the recent initial public offering that had revolutionized our sector. I stared at the screen. The numbers sat there, bold and undeniable. A performance bonus of $150,000 had cleared just 2 days ago. It was blood, sweat, and sleepless nights rendered in digital ink. Money they knew absolutely nothing about. Money they would never be allowed to touch. The next morning, the Boston air was crisp and biting. I bypassed the office. My destination was the Porsche dealership downtown. The showroom was immaculate, smelling of expensive leather and polished metal. A salesman in a tailored suit approached me, his smile practiced but polite. He probably looked at my casual attire and figured I was there to browse. He miscalculated. I walked past the entry models and stopped in front of a smoke-gray Porsche Cayenne. It sat under the showroom lights, looking like a storm waiting to break. It was beautiful. It was powerful. It was everything I had never been allowed to be in Margaret and Samuel's house. "Would you like to schedule a test drive for this weekend?" the salesman asked, clasping his hands behind his back. Running my fingers along the smooth, cold hood of the car, I thought about the 12-year-old girl freezing in the snow. I thought about the 30-year-old woman sitting alone with a stale cupcake. $110,000 was a monumental sum. To anyone else, it might have seemed impulsive. To me, it was a calculated investment in my own autonomy. "No test drive," I said, my voice completely steady. "I am taking it today." He blinked, clearly taken aback. "Of course. Let us look at our financing options. We have excellent rates right now." "I do not need financing," I replied, pulling my driver's license from my bag. "I am paying cash, $110,000. The paperwork took less than 2 hours. Every signature felt like severing an old, rusted chain. When the finance manager handed me the heavy, metallic key fob, my nerves held perfectly still. There was no guilt. There was only a profound, echoing silence in my chest. Slipping into the driver's seat, I pressed the ignition. The engine purred softly. I parked the Cayenne in the underground garage of my apartment building. Sitting there for a long moment, I simply breathed in the scent of new luxury leather. Then, I pulled out my phone. I snapped a single, clear photo of the steering wheel, making sure the iconic crest was perfectly centered in the frame. Opening our group chat, I saw the last message was a photo Margaret had sent yesterday, showing Jackson in his pristine white doctor's coat, standing in front of his new clinic doors. I uploaded my photo. I typed a simple caption, "Birthday gift," to myself, and hit send. The elevator had not even arrived before my phone started vibrating. It was not a steady buzz. It was a frantic, continuous seizure. 5 minutes. That was all it took for the illusion of their perfect familial dynamic to shatter. I watched the notifications stack up on my lock screen. 3 missed calls from Margaret, 5 text messages from Samuel. The first text was from Margaret. "Sadie, whose car is this? Why are you sitting in a Porsche? The elevator doors slid open, and my phone rang again. Margaret's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring out. It immediately rang again. I silenced the device and stepped into the quiet hallway of my floor. Then came Samuel's messages. They were not questions, they were interrogations. Sadie, answer Margaret. Is this some kind of lease you do not make the kind of money for a stunt like this? Jackson chimed in soon after. Wow, trying a little too hard to steal the spotlight this week, aren't we? Not a single message asked how my birthday was. Not one of them typed the words happy birthday. Their only concern was that the invisible sister had suddenly stepped out of her designated, miserable corner and threatened to cast a shadow over Jackson's achievements. Unlocking my front door, I tossed my keys onto the counter. My screen lit up with another barrage from Margaret. Her tone shifted from confused to accusatory. Are you involved in something illegal? How did you pay for this? Answer me right now. It was darkly hilarious. I had worked 80-hour weeks, led massive engineering teams, and built a flawless professional reputation. Yet, in Margaret's eyes, the only logical explanation for my success was criminal activity. Because to admit I was successful meant admitting she had been completely wrong to write me off. Finally, Samuel delivered his ultimate decree. This behavior is incredibly reckless and suspicious. You are coming to the house for dinner tomorrow night. We are having a meeting about your finances. Do not be late. An invitation disguised as a subpoena. They wanted to drag me back into the courtroom of their judgment. They expected the old Sadie to show up, head bowed, ready to explain herself and beg for their meager approval. I picked up my phone and typed a one-word reply to Samuel. Fine. Tomorrow would be their reckoning. Before facing Samuel and Margaret, I needed to handle the practicalities of my new reality. A luxury vehicle required premium insurance coverage, and I wanted the policy active before driving it to their suburban stronghold. Booting up my workstation, I requested a comprehensive credit report. It was a standard procedure, something I did annually anyway to monitor my identity. My credit score was immaculate. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously managing my finances, terrified of relying on anyone else for survival. But as I scrolled through the detailed historical data, my eyes caught a strange anomaly buried deep in the closed account section. It was a flag from the year 2014. Leaning closer to the monitor, my brow furrowed in confusion. In 2014, I was 18 years old. I had just moved out, working double shifts at a campus diner to pay for my freshman textbooks. I barely had enough money to cover a prepaid phone plan, let alone secure major corporate credit. Yet, the report showed a massive, delinquent loan that had been opened and then aggressively defaulted on, before mysteriously being settled and expunged years later. The original amount was staggering. It made absolutely no sense. I had always assumed the few credit hiccups in my early 20s were just administrative errors or side effects of my own financial ignorance. 4 grueling years had been spent fixing what I thought were my own mistakes. But I was not an ignorant college student anymore. I was a lead software engineer. Data was my native language, and data never lied. Bypassing the standard consumer interface, I ran a deeper diagnostic script on the account history, pulling the digital footprints associated with the original loan application. I opened up my secure terminal and started running a packet trace. The raw data trickled in, line by line. I checked the origination protocol address used to file the electronic paperwork. My breath caught in my throat. I ran the address through a geolocation tracer just to be absolutely certain. The coordinates pinpointed a very specific, very familiar neighborhood. It was the exact address of Margaret and Samuel's old house. The house I had desperately fled. The loan had not been a system error. It had been opened from their living room. Sitting back in my ergonomic chair, the glow of the dual monitors cast long shadows across my office. A cold wave of realization washed over me. At 18, I had trusted them with my documents. I had left my social security card in Samuel's safe for safekeeping until I got my own apartment. They had not just neglected me. They had actively used my identity. They had mined my future to fund whatever lifestyle they were building, all while telling me they had nothing to spare for my tuition. Staring at the blinking cursor on my screen, I knew this was no longer about a missed birthday. This was about a stolen life. What else did they hide? To understand the depth of the data glowing on my screen, you have to understand the ghosts that haunted my childhood. Growing up with Margaret and Samuel was like living behind a thick wall of soundproof glass. I could see the warmth of a family, but I was never permitted to feel it. The forgotten 12th birthday in the blizzard was just the overture. The symphony of their neglect played on a continuous, subtle loop. Take my high school graduation, for example. I had graduated at the top of my class, securing a partial academic scholarship that I had fought tooth and nail to get. Standing on the auditorium stage, I scanned the sea of proud relatives holding bouquets and cameras. I looked until my eyes burned. The 2 seats I had reserved remained empty. Later, when I took the public bus home alone in my graduation gown, Margaret casually mentioned that Jackson had a minor piano recital that evening. They simply could not miss his solo. My valedictorian status was met with a dismissive nod and a plate of cold leftovers. Or consider the winter I turned 19. A severe strain of pneumonia caught me while living in my freezing off-campus dorm, delirious with fever and struggling to breathe. I called Samuel, begging him to drive me to the urgent care clinic because I was too weak to stand. He sighed heavily into the receiver, sounding infinitely burdened by my existence. "Sadie, Jackson has an important medical school interview tomorrow. We need the house quiet so he can rest. Take an aspirin and sleep it off." Calling an ambulance was my only option. 3 days in the hospital were spent alone. No visits, no phone calls, just the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor keeping me company. Jackson was always the sun around which their universe orbited. He was the golden child, destined to be a brilliant surgeon, destined to elevate their social standing. I was merely the shadow, the unfortunate byproduct of their early marriage, expected to fade quietly into the background and demand absolutely nothing. I learned to shrink myself. Silencing my needs became second nature. If nothing was asked for, disappointment could not follow when nothing was given. The belief remained that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved I was self-sufficient, they would eventually look at me with the same sparkling pride they reserved for Jackson. But looking at the fraudulent loan data on my monitor, that naive childhood illusion shattered completely. They had not just ignored me because I was uninteresting, they had ignored me because it made it easier to use me. A silent child does not complain when her pockets are picked. A neglected daughter does not ask to see her own financial records. Every ignored milestone was a calculated strategy. The truth was devastatingly clear. People often ask why victims of familial manipulation do not just walk away sooner. Why did a capable, intelligent woman like me continue to answer their calls, attend their hollow dinners, and send money to cover Jackson's minor expenses for over a decade? Psychologists call it learned helplessness. It is an invisible chain forged in childhood. When Margaret and Samuel constantly condition you to believe your worth is tied to your utility, you stop trying to escape. You become convinced that the cold scraps of affection they occasionally toss your way are all you deserve. The neglected child inside me was still trying to buy their love. Jackson's phone bills were paid, and Samuel's computer networks were fixed because it was the only time they ever said my name without a heavy sigh. The only person who never treated me like a broken automated teller machine was my grandfather, Asher. Grandpa Asher was Samuel's father, but they could not have been more different. Asher was a quiet, observant man who smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. While Margaret and Samuel paraded Jackson in front of their country club friends, Asher would retreat to his study and motion for me to follow. He was the one who bought me my first desktop computer. When I was 14, hiding from the noise of Jackson's grand birthday bash. Asher sat beside me as I wrote my very first lines of code. He looked at the glowing screen, then looked at me with eyes that saw right through my defensive shell. "You have a builder's mind, Sadie," he had told me, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "Margaret and Samuel do not understand it, because they only know how to consume. But you are going to build fortresses." Asher passed away 10 years ago. His death was the defining tragedy of my early adulthood. Before he slipped into his final coma, I sat by his hospital bed. Margaret and Samuel were outside in the hallway, loudly arguing over the hospital cafeteria food. Asher squeezed my hand with surprising strength. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were intensely focused. He pulled me close and whispered a long, seemingly random string of numbers and letters directly into my ear. "Memorize it," he rasped. "The old copy of Moby Dick. In the study, keep it safe. Sadie, do not let them touch it." The sequence was memorized. The book was taken from his study before Samuel cleared out the estate. But for 10 years, the meaning remained a mystery. It seemed like the rambling of a dying man's mind. Now, staring at the digital proof of financial treason, Asher's dying words echoed in my quiet office with terrifying clarity. He knew exactly what they were capable of, and he had tried to leave me a shield. I needed a legal expert. Diane Kay operated out of a sleek, glass-walled office in the heart of Boston's financial district. Meticulous research had preceded my appointment. She was a senior partner specializing in white-collar crime, financial fraud, and asset recovery. A family therapist was not what I needed, and Diane was not cheap. I wanted someone to help me dissect their crimes. Sitting across from her massive mahogany desk, I slid a heavily encrypted thumb drive across the polished wood. Diane was in her late 50s, with sharp silver hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She plugged the drive into her secure terminal and began reviewing the preliminary credit reports I had pulled. Alongside the geolocation data trace pointing to my parents' old suburban address. "Family fraud is incredibly common, Sadie," Diane said, her voice smooth and strictly professional. "Parents often rationalize using a child's clean social security number as a temporary bridge during hard times. They tell themselves they will pay it back before the child ever finds out. But this," she tapped a manicured fingernail against the screen, "this is not a temporary bridge. This is a sustained, calculated extraction." My posture remained perfectly rigid. "I need to know the exact origin of that 2014 loan, the original application documents, the signature logs, and the routing numbers for where that money was deposited are required. My suspicion is they forged my signature when I was 18 and living in a college dorm." Diane leaned back in her leather chair, studying me carefully. Most of her clients probably cried in this chair, agonizing over the betrayal of their own blood. But crying over them in secret was a habit I had abandoned. There were no tears left to shed in a corporate law office. "I can subpoena the original loan origination files," Diane told me, lacing her fingers together. "Banks keep digital and physical archives of these transactions, especially for amounts this substantial. But you need to be prepared. Sadie, if we pull these records and prove forgery, we are crossing a line. We are moving from a family dispute into federal felony territory. Identity theft and wire fraud carry mandatory minimum sentences. Are you prepared to do that to your parents?" Looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Boston skyline, I thought about the decades of being treated like a ghost, the relentless gaslighting, the financial manipulation, and the sheer entitlement they displayed every single day played in my mind. They had never worried about crossing a line with me. "Pull the records, Diane," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "Every single one of them." A small, approving nod came from Diane. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and a silver fountain pen. Give me 48 hours to get the hard copies from the lending institution. In the meantime, play normal. Do not tip your hand. Smoothing the front of my blazer, I stood up. A strange, cold peace settled over my shoulders. The countdown had officially begun. The gravel in Margaret and Samuel's driveway crunched loudly beneath the tires of my new Porsche Cayenne. Deliberately parking under the glow of their porch light ensured the aggressive, sleek lines of the luxury vehicle were the first thing they would see when they looked out the bay window. This was the dinner Samuel had demanded. The family meeting to address my so-called reckless behavior. Walking through the front door, the heavy key fob felt solid in my pocket. The house smelled intensely of roasted rosemary and tension. Margaret hurried out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. A bright, entirely synthetic smile was forced onto her face. "Sadie, you made it," she chirped, her eyes immediately darting past my shoulder to glance out the window at the driveway. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Come sit. Jackson is already here." Jackson lounged at the dining table, wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than my first car. Swirling a glass of red wine, he looked at me with an expression of amused pity. Samuel sat at the head of the table, his arms crossed over his chest, projecting his usual aura of unquestionable authority. "So," Samuel began, skipping any form of greeting, "we saw the car outside. It is quite a flashy lease. Sadie, extremely irresponsible." Pulling out a chair, I sat down and carefully unfolded my cloth napkin. "It is not a lease. I bought it." Margaret gasped softly, pressing a hand to her chest. Jackson let out a short, mocking laugh. "Right. With what money help desk support does not pay Porsche money. Sadie, are you swimming in credit card debt now?" "I paid cash," I said softly, pouring myself a glass of ice water. $110,000. From my performance bonus, I am a lead software engineer. Jackson, I have been for 3 years. Silence slammed into the dining room like a physical weight. Samuel's face turned a mottled shade of red. Margaret looked at me as if I were a stranger who had just broken into her home. The dynamic they had relied on for 30 years, the successful son and the struggling, dependent daughter, was disintegrating right in front of their eyes. Samuel cleared his throat, leaning forward heavily on the polished maple table. "If you have that kind of liquid capital lying around, you have absolutely no business blowing it on a luxury vehicle. Jackson is expanding his clinic next month. He needs capital for new diagnostic machines. You're going to return that car tomorrow, take the refund, and put that money into the family fund." It was not a request. It was a royal decree. The belief that my success was simply a resource for them to harvest was entirely genuine on their part. Jackson was nodding in agreement. I looked at him, and then at Samuel. My voice was not raised. Arguments were unnecessary. Pushing my chair back, I stood up. "My money is my own," I said, "and the family fund is closed. I left the cake untouched." My phone buzzed precisely at 9 a.m. on Tuesday. It was Diane K. Her tone was brisk, stripped of any conversational pleasantries. "I have the origination files. You need to come to my office, now." When I arrived, Diane did not offer me coffee. She simply pushed a thick manila folder across the polished expanse of her desk. The tab was labeled with my legal name and the year 2014. Flipping it open, my hands were perfectly steady, but the air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. It was a master promissory note for a personal business loan. The principal amount was $200,000. The stated purpose of the loan was listed as medical equipment leasing and preparatory educational expenses. Staring at the paperwork, the pieces connected. In 2014, Jackson was just entering his expensive pre-med program, rubbing elbows with elite doctors, and joining exclusive medical fraternities that required astronomical membership fees. Margaret and Samuel had constantly complained about the financial strain, constantly telling me I had to take out my own exorbitant student loans because the family was completely tapped out. I flipped to the signature page. There, on the dotted line, was my name, Sadie Elise Thorne. But it was not my handwriting. The loops were too tight, the slant too aggressive. It was a flawless imitation of my signature, practiced and executed with chilling precision. Beneath the forged signature was my social security number, cleanly typed out. They used your identity to secure a high-risk medical loan for Jackson, Diane explained, her voice remarkably gentle for a corporate shark. Because they had already over-leveraged their own credit lines. They took out $200,000 in your name, funneled the cash into Jackson's education and lifestyle, and then deliberately let the loan default. The sheer scale of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Living on instant ramen in my freezing dorm room, terrified of bouncing a $20 check, flashed through my mind. Sobbing over my textbooks because I thought I was a financial failure was a common occurrence. All the while, my parents had strapped a $200,000 anchor to my back so Jackson could float to the top. When Jackson started his residency and making real money, Diane continued, pointing to a secondary document. They quietly settled the debt for pennies on the dollar to avoid a lawsuit, but the default status remained on your credit history for 7 years. They ruined your financial foundation to build his. They had not just neglected me. They had sacrificed me. Looking at their 18-year-old daughter, they had seen nothing but a disposable line of credit. The anger that had been simmering inside me finally crystallized into something hard, cold, and razor-sharp. Closing the manila folder, I traced the edge of the cardboard with my thumb. This was the weapon I needed. They had stolen my name. The physical transit out of Diane's building felt like logging out of a secure server. The driver's seat of the Porsche offered a perfectly isolated local environment. The city of Boston moved around me in a blur of yellow cabs and hurried pedestrians. But the interior of the car was perfectly silent. Placing the copied file of the forged loan documents on the passenger seat, I knew what needed to happen next. I needed to hear Samuel say it. One final, infinitesimal chance to act like a father was required before I burned his world to the ground. Connecting my phone to the car's Bluetooth system, I dialed his number. He answered on the third ring. "Sadie," Samuel barked, his voice immediately laced with irritation. "If you are calling to apologize for your ridiculous behavior at dinner, make it quick. I am at the golf club." "I am not calling to apologize," I said, keeping my voice incredibly even. "I am calling to ask you about the summer of 2014. I want to ask you about a $200,000 personal loan taken out under my Social Security number." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. For 5 long seconds, only the faint sound of wind against his phone receiver could be heard. Processing the fact that his greatest secret had just been unearthed took a moment. When he finally spoke, his tone was defensive, aggressive, and entirely devoid of remorse. "I have no idea what you are talking about. You were careless with your money back then." "I have the origination documents, Samuel," I replied, refusing to call him Dad. "I have the forged signature. I know the money went to Jackson's medical prep programs. Do you really want to lie to me right now?" He exploded. The facade of the distinguished patriarch vanished, replaced by the cornered panic of a guilty man. "How dare you speak to me like that? We raised you. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. You owed us for everything we provided. If we had to shuffle some paperwork to ensure your brother's success, you should be grateful we kept the family afloat." There it was, the ultimate gaslight. In his twisted reality, stealing my identity and ruining my credit was a noble sacrifice for the greater good of his golden child. A daughter was not seen. Only a highly convenient asset was acknowledged. "You are an ungrateful, selfish girl," Samuel spat, his voice rising in volume. "You buy a flashy car to throw in our faces, and now you dig up ancient history to try and ruin your brother's clinic launch. You are toxic. Sadie, do not bother coming home or speaking to us until you are ready to grovel for an apology." He did not wait for my response. The line went completely dead. Tossing my phone onto the passenger seat right on top of the forged loan documents, I did not cry. My chest did not heave with the familiar, suffocating anxiety that used to follow Samuel's reprimands. Instead, a profound and absolute silence settled over my mind. The toxic umbilical cord that had tethered me to their approval had finally snapped. Driving back to my apartment with precise, measured movements felt liberating. I brewed a cup of black coffee, sat down at my kitchen island, and opened my personal laptop. For the past 7 years, out of a pathetic sense of familial obligation, their digital and administrative lives had been quietly subsidized by my income. The premium family cell phone plan was paid for. The high-speed internet at their house was covered. All their streaming services, their premium delivery accounts, and the backup credit card Jackson kept in his wallet for emergencies were funded by me. A systematic purge was required. Logging into the telecommunications portal was the first step. Margaret, Samuel, and Jackson's phone numbers were selected. With 3 rapid clicks, their lines were severed from my master account, effectively terminating their cellular service. Next, the banking portal. Navigating to Jackson's emergency credit card. The Report Lost button was clicked, permanently closing the account. Proceeding down the list was like a machine deleting corrupted code. Streaming networks, cloud storage, premium delivery services. Every single password was changed to a complex, randomly generated 32-character string. Remote logouts were initiated across all connected devices. The active user count on my dashboard dropped from 4 down to 1. Picking up my phone, the final configurations were set. Margaret, block caller, Samuel, block caller, Jackson, block caller. Their emails were routed to a hidden spam folder set to auto-delete every 30 days. No dramatic note was left. No passive-aggressive status was posted on social media. Access to my resources, my energy, and my life was simply erased. If they wanted me to be invisible, they were going to get exactly what they asked for. Becoming a ghost that they could no longer exploit was the new operating procedure. Closing my laptop, I took a sip of my coffee. The apartment was beautifully quiet. For the first time in 30 years, I did not belong to them. I was finally entirely mine. 6 months passed in absolute, uninterrupted silence. The block features on my phone and email worked perfectly. Without the constant, draining demands of Margaret and Samuel, my professional life accelerated at a staggering pace. Every ounce of my reclaimed energy was poured into my cybersecurity startup. A revolutionary data protection protocol was launched, catching the attention of major tech conglomerates. Our valuation skyrocketed. As the lead software engineer and a foundational partner, my equity in the company grew exponentially. Financial stability was no longer the goal. A formidable fortress of wealth was being built. One crisp Tuesday morning, a heavy package arrived at my sleek corner office. Slicing open the cardboard envelope revealed a glossy magazine. It was the latest issue of a prominent national business publication, featuring their annual 30 Under 30 list for technology innovators. Staring at the cover, my own face looked back at me. A sharp navy blazer, arms crossed while standing in a server room, projecting complete control. The headline beneath my name read, "The Architect of Digital Fortresses." Running my fingers over the glossy paper, the little girl who had to hide in a dusty study just to learn how to write basic code came to mind. The teenager who survived on cheap noodles because her parents claimed they were entirely broke felt very distant now. If Jackson had been featured in a local community newsletter, a catered banquet would have been thrown by Margaret and Samuel. Laminated copies would have been mailed to every distant relative and country club acquaintance. But my face was on the cover of a national magazine, and my biological family had absolutely no idea. The technology sector was not something they followed. Business journals were not part of their reading material. because I had been categorized as a low-level help desk drone a decade ago. Their mental file on me was never updated. The empire being built right under their noses was completely invisible to them. Placing the magazine on the edge of my mahogany desk. The beautiful validation of hard work was undeniable, but the silence from my blood relatives still carried a faint, residual sting. It was the final confirmation that their lack of interest was never about a lack of achievements. The deliberate refusal to see me was the core issue. Being seen by them was no longer necessary. The world was beginning to notice, and that was more than enough. Turning back to my dual monitors, lines of code were typed with a renewed, fierce focus. Every keystroke was a brick in the wall, separating my new life from their toxic influence. They missed my reinvention. My evenings were no longer spent running tedious errands for Jackson or fixing Samuel's home network. Instead, the twilight hours were spent in the sterile, heavily air-conditioned conference room of Diane K's law firm. A legal labyrinth was being meticulously constructed, one that Margaret and Samuel would never be able to navigate. Diane sat at the head of a massive glass table, surrounded by towering stacks of financial records, protocol address logs, and banking subpoenas. She operated with the cold precision of a surgeon. The exact timeline of the $200,000 medical loan, fraudulently secured using my Social Security number, was being mapped out. The statute of limitations on wire fraud and identity theft is a complex web, Diane explained, adjusting her silver-rimmed glasses. But because they continued to make small, manipulative payments to keep the debt artificially active before settling, they inadvertently extended their own liability window. They essentially kept the crime alive. A printed spreadsheet detailing the extracted geolocation data was handed to her. The digital signature timestamps have been cross-referenced with their home internet protocol address from the summer of 2014. Employment records also show I was physically clocked in at my campus diner job at the exact moment the loan application was digitally signed. Diane smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the predatory grin of a lawyer holding a definitive advantage. This is bulletproof. Sadie. The digital forensics eliminate any plausible deniability. They cannot claim you gave verbal consent or signed a paper copy in their presence. The evidence was organized into 3 identical, heavy binders. One for Diane, one for me, and one for the upcoming confrontation. Every page was stamped, verified, and notarized. A case that could easily trigger a federal indictment was being built. I need you to understand the gravity of this, Diane warned, closing the master file. Once I serve them with this evidence, the familial bridge is burned to ash. Total financial ruin, and potentially prison time, await them if they do not capitulate to our restitution demands. Are you entirely certain you want to cross this Rubicon? Looking at the thick black binder resting on the glass table, the panic attacks that used to accompany credit score checks were remembered. The crushing weight of a debt I had never authorized had shaped my early adulthood. The Rubicon had already been crossed the night I bought my car. Waiting for them to catch up was the only remaining step. I am certain, I replied without a single tremor in my voice. We forged the weapon. The illusion of peace shattered on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The office line buzzed, the receptionist sounding slightly hesitant. My mother was waiting in the lobby and refusing to leave until she spoke with me. Margaret had finally realized her phone calls and text messages were permanently blocked. Taking a deep breath, I smoothed my blazer and walked out to the glass-walled reception area. Margaret sat on a plush leather sofa, clutching a large paper coffee cup. Seeing me, she immediately stood up, plastering on a fragile, loving smile that did not reach her eyes. Sadie, darling, I have been so worried. Your phone must be broken, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. A hug was not offered. A solid 3 feet of distance was maintained between us. My phone works perfectly. Margaret, what do you want? Flinching at the use of her first name, she quickly masked her irritation. Reaching into her expensive designer tote bag, she pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents. Jackson is securing the final round of financing for his clinic expansion. The bank requires a secondary guarantor with an immaculate credit history. Your father and I are a little over-leveraged right now. Your signature on this co-signer agreement is all we need. It is just a formality, I promise. Staring at the paperwork in her hands, the sheer audacity was almost breathtaking. The fraud triangle consists of pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. Margaret felt the immense social pressure of Jackson's expensive clinic. My unblemished financial record was viewed as the perfect opportunity. The exploitation was rationalized by the belief that a daughter is inherently obligated to fund her family's ambitions. In her mind, a small favor was being asked. In reality, an attempt to shackle me to a massive commercial debt was occurring right after previous identity theft had been uncovered. She had no idea that a federal case against her had been built over the last month. Bringing this document was the ultimate display of predatory arrogance. It was also a spectacular legal misstep. "Leave the documents," I told her, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "I will review them." Margaret beamed, visibly relieved. Reverting to old, obedient programming was exactly what she expected. Patting my arm, she hurried out of the lobby, eager to report her success to Samuel and Jackson. She handed me the rope. If you have ever had someone mistake your silence for weakness, hit like. It is time they learn the difference. Carrying the loan documents back to my office, I dropped them onto my desk like a piece of contaminated evidence. Scanning the pages, the numbers were clear. Jackson was attempting to borrow a staggering $500,000 for state-of-the-art diagnostic imaging machines. Signing as the guarantor meant becoming legally responsible for the entire $500,000 burden the moment his clinic encountered financial turbulence. An hour later, an email slipped through the corporate firewall. It was from Jackson. Since his phone number was blocked, tracking down my professional email address was his workaround. "Mom said she dropped off the paperwork." The email read, "Sign it and overnight it to the bank. Do not make a big deal out of this. You already embarrassed the family enough with that ridiculous car stunt. It is time you actually contributed something useful to my practice." He did not ask nicely. Servitude was demanded. His medical degree supposedly made him a superior life form, entitled to the fruits of my labor. Sitting back, I steepled my fingers. Replying directly to his arrogant email was unnecessary. Instead, a new message window was opened, adding Margaret, Samuel, and Jackson to the recipient list. A very brief, formal notification was drafted. "I have reviewed the loan documents. I will not be signing them today. If you want to discuss my financial contributions to this family, you will meet me at the law offices of Diane K. in downtown Boston. Friday morning, 10 o'clock sharp. Attendance is not optional if you want this resolved." Send was clicked, explaining who Diane K. did not happen. The stolen Social Security number or the fraudulent medical loans were not mentioned. The stage was simply set. Their blinding greed and desperate need to secure a signature would force them to show up. Walking into a corporate law firm expecting to bully a compliant daughter into a corner was exactly what they would do. Locking my computer, I picked up my briefcase and walked out of the office. The storm was coming, and I was holding the lightning. The trap was officially set. It was Wednesday evening, 2 days before the scheduled confrontation at Diane's office. Standing in my apartment, the printed files were reviewed one last time to ensure every piece of evidence was in perfect chronological order. Reaching for a highlighter, my elbow brushed against a stack of old books on my floating shelf. A weathered, fabric-bound copy of Moby Dick slid out and hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. Freezing. I stared down at the faded gold lettering on the spine. It was the book Grandpa Asher had desperately told me to protect right before he slipped into his final coma. Kept safe for a decade. The cryptic string of numbers he had whispered into my ear had been completely forgotten. Kneeling down, the fragile book was carefully picked up. The pages smelled of aged paper and old pipe tobacco. Opening the front cover, Asher's shaky, elegant cursive was visible on the blank title page. It listed a secure internet protocol address, followed by the words, "For Sadie. When the wolves come." My heart hammered against my ribs. Moving quickly to my home workstation, the complex web address was typed into a secure browser. A stark, black login screen appeared, displaying nothing but a single password prompt. Closing my eyes, the archives of my memory were accessed. The hospital room, the steady hum of the heart monitor, Asher pulling me close. The alphanumeric string he had whispered 10 years ago was typed in. It was a complex hash, ending with my exact date of birth. The enter key was pressed. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second. A loading bar appeared, crawling slowly across the black background. The encryption protocols on the server were outdated but incredibly dense. Workstation fans whirred loudly, processing the decryption keys. Holding my breath, the realization hit that this digital ghost had been waiting for 10 years. Focus on the $200,000 identity theft had caused Asher's final warning to slip away entirely. The loading bar hit 100%. The black screen vanished, replaced by a clean, white file directory. Only one folder sat in the center of the digital vault. It was labeled with my full legal name and the year 2008. The digital vault unlocked. Sitting frozen in my home office, I stared at the scanned documents rendering on my high-resolution monitor. The digital folder contained a meticulously drafted, irrevocable trust agreement. It had been legally established by Grandpa Asher when I was just 10 years old. Scrolling down to the principal amount, the initial deposit was a staggering $1,200,000. The terms of the trust were explicitly clear. The funds were entirely locked and protected until my 25th birthday. Designed as a permanent financial bedrock for my adult life, it ensured I would never be dependent on anyone. He specifically wanted to ensure I would never be trapped under Margaret and Samuel's control. But there were more files in the directory. Clicking on a subfolder labeled with bank transfer logs from 2014. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the fraudulent personal loan discovered earlier. But this betrayal was exponentially worse. Margaret and Samuel had not just taken out a sketchy loan in my name. They had used that fraudulent loan, alongside a counterfeit power of attorney, to convince a negligent trust administrator that financial incapacitation required parental intervention. Asher's legal firewall was systematically dismantled. Over the course of 3 months during the summer of 2014, the trust was completely liquidated. $1,200,000 erased. Leaning back, the cold leather of my ergonomic chair pressed against my spine. My inheritance was drained to buy Jackson his way into the elite medical fraternity. It purchased his luxury apartment near campus and funded extravagant European vacations, taken while I worked double shifts at a diner. Asher had tried to protect me from the grave. His final wishes were violated just as easily as my identity. I did not scream. Nothing was thrown across the room. The print command was simply executed. Thick stacks of paper slid out of the laser printer. Each page represented a separate felony. Each page represented a year spent feeling inadequate and burdensome, initially planning to confront them over a $200,000 identity theft. The stakes had now quintupled. The fresh, warm stack of paper was picked up and placed carefully into a new, separate binder. Seeking an apology or a basic credit repair was no longer the objective. A massive, orchestrated financial heist perpetrated by my own blood was sitting on my desk. Turning off the monitors, I sat in the dark for a long time. The silence in my apartment was no longer lonely. It was the silence of a loaded weapon. The evidence was overwhelming. Thursday afternoon, less than 24 hours before the scheduled confrontation, I walked back into Diane K's pristine corporate office, carrying the new, heavy binder compiled the night before. Diane was already at the glass table, reviewing our previous files. Wearing a tailored gray suit, she appeared entirely unbothered by the impending storm. The new binder was placed squarely in the center of her desk. "What is this, Sadie?" Diane asked, raising a perfectly arched silver eyebrow. "I thought we had finalized the financial timelines for the identity theft." "We did," I said, taking a seat across from her. "But I found something else, something Asher left behind." Diane pulled the binder toward her and opened the cover. The seasoned, white-collar defense attorney looked genuinely shocked. Reading through the irrevocable trust documents, her eyes scanned the complex legal jargon. She traced the forged signatures and the illicit transfer logs with her expensive fountain pen. $1,200,000, she murmured, her tone shifting from strictly professional to predatory. They breached a fully protected, irrevocable trust. This elevates the entire situation from a standard identity fraud case into a massive, multi-tiered federal crime. The next 6 hours were spent organizing the final trap. 3 identical, heavy binders were created. Each binder was meticulously tabbed, cross-referenced, and officially stamped with a notary seal. They contained the geolocation data, the forged promissory notes, the trust liquidation logs, and the draft of a devastating legal complaint. They will walk in here tomorrow, expecting to manipulate a lonely, submissive daughter, Diane said, closing the final binder with a sharp, echoing snap. They have absolutely no idea they are walking into a financial execution. Looking at the black binders lined up on the table, 30 years of pain, neglect, and gaslighting were finally distilled into undeniable, actionable truth. A surge of cold adrenaline flowed through me. I was ready to watch their arrogant illusions shatter against the hard concrete of reality. If you are ready for the real drop, stay with me. Hit like if you know exactly how it feels to finally take your power back. Thanking Diane. I walked out into the Boston evening. The city lights flickered against the damp pavement. Driving the Porsche home, the engine hummed a low, steady rhythm. Anxiety about the morning was entirely absent. Sleep came easier that night than it had in a decade. Tomorrow would change everything. Friday morning, 10 o'clock sharp. The Boston sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Sitting at the head of the long conference table in Diane's office, I wore a tailored black blazer, hair pulled back tightly into a pristine knot. The 3 identical black binders were placed neatly in front of the empty leather chairs opposite me. Diane stood by the window, her arms crossed, projecting an aura of absolute legal menace. The heavy glass doors swung open. Samuel walked in first. Wearing his usual country club attire, he puffed out his chest as if the entire building belonged to him. Margaret followed closely behind, clutching her designer handbag. A maternal look was attempted, but the underlying smugness was impossible to hide. Jackson sauntered in last, checking messages on his expensive phone, annoyed that his morning routine was disrupted. "Well, this is entirely unnecessary," Samuel declared, not bothering to greet me. Gesturing around the corporate boardroom dismissively, he continued, "You could have just signed the loan paperwork at our house. Sadie, dragging us down to a lawyer's office for a simple family signature is incredibly dramatic." Margaret chimed in, taking the seat directly across from me. "We know you are still upset about your birthday, darling, but Jackson really needs this funding to finalize the clinic expansion. We can celebrate properly next weekend." Jackson let out an exasperated sigh, slumping into his plush chair. "Just give me the pen, Sadie. I have a general contractor waiting at the construction site. Let us get this over with." A professional lead engineer was not seen. An independent woman who had built a life from scratch was invisible. The obedient ghost they had created and exploited for 30 years was all they recognized. Coffee was not offered. Condescending small talk was not engaged. Reaching out, A button on a small, discreet digital recorder resting in the center of the mahogany table was pressed. A tiny red light blinked to life. "This meeting is now being recorded for legal documentation," Diane stated, her voice slicing through the room like a cold blade. Samuel frowned, his manufactured confidence faltering slightly, looking at the red light, then at the binders. "Recorded, what on earth is this about we are here for a loan signature?" Looking directly into Samuel's eyes, a perfectly blank mask was maintained. Hands were placed flat on the table. The trap snapped shut. "Open the binder in front of you," I commanded. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. It was the exact tone used when debugging a critical system failure. "Turn to tab 3. Margaret hesitated, glancing nervously at Samuel. Jackson rolled his eyes, finding the theatrics tiresome, but he flipped the heavy cover open. Samuel aggressively turned the pages, expecting to see a standard commercial loan contract awaiting a signature. Instead, his eyes landed on a crisp, notarized copy of Asher's irrevocable trust agreement. The color drained entirely from Samuel's face. The ruddy, arrogant flush vanished, leaving behind a pale, sickening gray. He stared at the signature lines and the bank transfer logs. His mouth hung slightly open, paralyzed by the sudden exposure. "In the summer of 2014, I said, leaning forward slightly, "you and Margaret systematically liquidated a protected trust fund containing $1,200,000. A fund legally established by Asher, expressly naming me as the sole beneficiary." Margaret let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her designer bag slipped off her lap and hit the floor. "Sadie, you do not understand. We had to manage the family assets. Asher was senile when he drafted that document." "He was perfectly lucid," Diane interjected sharply from the window. "And the trust was irrevocable. Your access to those funds was entirely illegal." Samuel slammed his hand down on the table, trying desperately to regain his shattered authority. "We are your parents. That money belonged to the family. Jackson needed his tuition paid. He needed his residency housing. We allocated resources where they were most needed to ensure the family's prestige. You have absolutely no right to question our financial management." He was practically shouting into the digital recorder. Unauthorized diversion of protected assets was being freely admitted. Arrogance and toxic entitlement blinded him from realizing a federal crime was being confessed on tape. Jackson stared at his parents, jaw tight, realizing his elite medical lifestyle was funded by stolen money. My voice remained steady. Samuel's pathetic, aggressive rationalization was not interrupted. The silence hung in the air for a long, torturous moment after he finally finished yelling. He breathed heavily, waiting for a retreat that would not come. "Turn to tab 15, I said quietly. The real nightmare began. Jackson was the first one to turn to tab 15. Staring down at the master promissory note, his eyes scanned the principal amount of $200,000, then darted quickly to the bottom of the page. The forged signature and my social security number printed clearly in black ink held his attention. "This is a commercial medical equipment loan," Jackson muttered, voice trembling with sudden, acute panic. Looking up at Margaret, his golden boy persona entirely stripped away. "Why does this have Sadie's social security number on it? This is my equipment." "Because they had already destroyed their own credit." I answered for her, eyes locked on Margaret's terrified, tear-streaked face. "They used my identity to secure the initial funding for your medical fraternity fees and your early equipment leases. They forged my signature, drained the cash, and then intentionally defaulted on the loan, destroying my credit score for 7 grueling years." Margaret started to hyperventilate. Reaching out, trying to grab Samuel's arm for support, he pulled away violently. He stared at the documents in utter disbelief. He had arrogantly assumed I would never possess the technical skills to trace the origin of that specific, deeply buried loan. You committed wire fraud and identity theft, Diane stated calmly, listing the charges like a mundane grocery list. Both are severe federal felonies. You also falsified legal documents to a federally insured financial institution, which carries mandatory minimum sentencing. Shifting my gaze back to Jackson, the golden child was sweating profusely. His pristine, expensive cashmere sweater suddenly looked very restrictive. Your entire medical career, Jackson, is built on a foundation of felony fraud. If I hand this binder over to the federal authorities, and if I forward a verified copy to the state medical board, what do you think will happen? Jackson swallowed hard, completely speechless. They will revoke your medical license before you even cut the ribbon on your shiny new clinic. I continued, delivering the words with surgical precision. You will be a convicted felon's son, complicit in receiving and utilizing stolen funds. Your career is entirely in my hands. Jackson pushed his chair back violently, standing up. I didn't know, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation, pointing an accusatory finger at Samuel. I swear to God, Sadie, I had absolutely no idea where the money was coming from. They told me it was an investment. Ignorance does not provide legal immunity, Diane noted dryly. Watching the three of them fracture, the unified, arrogant front they had walked in with was completely annihilated. A profound, chilling sense of satisfaction settled in. They were finally trapped. The new lawyer introduced himself as Mr. Aaron. He had been called in secretly by Samuel, arriving just as the accusations settled over the room. Aaron abruptly placed a document on the table. It was a power of attorney form, seemingly granting Margaret and Samuel full control over my financial affairs, dated 8 years prior. Aaron smiled, a sleek, practiced expression of corporate defense. My clients operated under full legal authority. Sadie, this document bears your signature. Any transfer of funds, while perhaps morally disagreeable to you now, was executed within the bounds of this agreement. Margaret and Samuel exchanged a look of desperate relief. They actually believed this fabricated piece of paper was their ultimate salvation. I did not flinch. Breathing remained entirely steady. Opening my laptop, the screen was brought to life and turned to face Mr. Aaron directly. That is a very impressive forgery, I said calmly. However, looking at this data is required before submitting that document to any authority. Aaron leaned in, his brow furrowing. That is detailed iCloud geolocation metadata, cross-referenced with official airline flight manifests. I explained, tracking the lines of data on the screen. On the date listed on that document, I was physically located in Silicon Valley, attending a mandatory engineering conference. Digital check-ins, hotel receipts, and badge scans prove I was 3,000 miles away from Boston. Aaron stared at the screen. The notary stamp on your document is from Massachusetts. Diane interjected, her voice deadly and quiet. Presenting a forged power of attorney to facilitate $1 million financial theft is a federal crime. By formally presenting it to us, Mr. Aaron, you are now legally holding a piece of criminal evidence. The State Bar Association will find this fascinating. Aaron turned ashen, looking at Samuel, then back at the metadata. The realization that his wealthy clients had lied to him hit hard. He was standing in the middle of a massive felony trap. Snatching the paper off the table, he shoved it into his briefcase and back toward the door. I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel. Aaron stammered to Samuel, practically running out of the room. The silence that followed was absolute. The final illusion of their power was completely shattered. Samuel collapsed into his chair, defeated. Margaret covered her face with her hands. Jackson simply stared at the floor. Diane slid the restitution agreement across the table. It demanded the full repayment of $1,200,000, plus interest, secured by the equity in their home and Jackson's clinic. "Sign it," I commanded. They signed the heavy papers. 6 months later, the bitter Boston winter had melted into a bright, promising spring. The heavy snow that used to trigger memories of a miserable 12th birthday was completely gone. Standing on the expansive balcony of my new penthouse apartment, my hands wrapped around a warm mug of premium espresso. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the glass skyscrapers of the financial district. My life was finally, truly, my own. The restitution agreement had executed with devastating efficiency. Building an entire life on a foundation of lies and stolen resources ensures the collapse is incredibly thorough. Margaret and Samuel had to immediately list their massive suburban house on the market. Sustaining the illusion of wealth was no longer affordable. The property was sold at a significant loss to cover the initial lump sum of their mandated repayment. They downsized to a small, unremarkable 2-bedroom condominium on the outskirts of the city. Lavish country club luncheons were a thing of the past. Samuel lost his prestigious golf membership. Their carefully curated social empire disintegrated the moment their stolen funding vanished. Jackson's grand clinic opening was a completely different event than the one originally planned. Without the stolen capital to secure his equipment loans, immediate bankruptcy loomed before seeing a single patient. Saving his medical license and avoiding total ruin required emergency outside investors. 70% of his ownership equity was sold just to keep the doors open. Jackson, the golden child who was supposed to be the master of his own medical empire, was now effectively a high-paid employee in a building bearing his name. Grueling. 12-hour shifts were worked under the strict supervision of a corporate board. The true meaning of exhausting, relentless labor was finally learned. Sorry for them was not a feeling that surfaced. A sudden wave of familial guilt never arrived. The consequences of their greed unfolded with the detached, analytical perspective of an engineer watching a faulty program crash exactly as predicted. They had harvested their storm. Taking a slow sip of my espresso, warmth spread through my chest. For 3 decades, they had treated me like an invisible resource, a convenient ghost summoned and dismissed at will. My silence was mistaken for permanent compliance. They never realized that every time they ignored me, the undisturbed silence needed to build my own strength was simply being provided. My phone buzzed gently on the patio table. A notification from my banking application confirmed a large, automated deposit. It was the monthly restitution installment from Samuel and Margaret's dwindling accounts. Swiping the notification away required no second thought. The money was not about vengeance anymore. It was about restoring a cosmic balance. It was about enforcing a permanent boundary. They harvested their own storm. Keeping the recovered $1,200,000 sitting idle in a basic brokerage account was never the plan. That money was never needed to survive, nor to thrive. My career as a lead software engineer had already provided more than enough financial security, but the immense power that wealth represented was understood. Grandpa Asher's original intention before his memory was erased by their greed was clear. Building fortresses was the goal. The spring was spent establishing a formalized philanthropic organization. The Asher Foundation was named in his honor. The primary mission of the foundation was explicitly clear and intensely personal. Comprehensive scholarships, high-end laptops, and advanced coding boot camps were provided for underprivileged girls living in the greater Boston area. Finding the quiet girls was the priority. Finding the brilliant, overlooked daughters sitting in the shadows of their own homes became the mission. Handing them the exact tools needed to code their own escape routes was the objective. One Tuesday afternoon, a visit to the Foundation's newly renovated learning center took place. The room was bright, filled with ergonomic desks and rows of state-of-the-art dual monitors. A group of 15 young girls sat at the stations, eyes focused intensely on the glowing screens as they learned the fundamentals of data encryption. Walking slowly down the aisle, the rapid, rhythmic clicking of their keyboards filled the space. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. Stopping behind a 12-year-old girl with frayed sneakers and a determined expression, I watched her struggle with a complex loop in her code. Leaning down, a missing semicolon on line 42 was pointed out, and her face lit up as the program finally executed perfectly. Turning around, she gave me a massive, brilliant smile. In her eyes, the exact reflection of the freezing girl who had stood in the blizzard holding a plastic trophy was visible. But this girl was not standing in the cold. She was sitting in a warm room, fully supported, entirely seen, and incredibly powerful. True justice is not just about tearing down the people who cause harm. Tearing down Margaret and Samuel had been necessary for survival. But it was not the ultimate destination. True justice is taking the bricks from the ruins of the past and using them to construct a sanctuary for someone else. Asher had planted a seed of hope a decade ago. Margaret and Samuel had tried to burn the soil, but the roots were already too deep. Through the foundation, that single seed was multiplying into a vast, unbreakable forest. Walking out of the learning center and into the bright afternoon sunlight, the fresh air felt lighter than it had in years. The heavy armor worn my entire life was finally obsolete. I built my own fortress. The process of healing is rarely a dramatic, cinematic event. It doesn't usually end with tearful hugs and sweeping declarations of unconditional love. Healing was quiet. It was the absolute absence of anxiety when my phone rang. It was the peace of knowing my resources were entirely my own. A few days after visiting the foundation, I sat at my home office desk, reviewing the quarterly reports for my startup. A new email appeared in my strictly filtered inbox. The sender address belonged to Jackson. He was the only member of the family not permanently blocked at the server level, solely to communicate regarding the monthly legal restitution payments for the clinic debt. Clicking open the message, it was incredibly brief. Attached was a confirmation receipt for a bank wire transfer of $4,000. Beneath the attachment, there was a single, uncharacteristically humble sentence. "I am sorry, Sadie, for everything." Staring at the glowing text for a long time, I realized 5 years ago, an apology from the golden child would have sent my heart racing. A long, emotional response offering total absolution would have been desperately typed out. Society constantly tells us that family is everything. We are conditioned to believe forgiveness requires reconciliation, and blood ties must eventually supersede all past betrayals. But the hard lesson learned was that toxic patterns do not magically disappear just because an apology is issued under the heavy threat of federal prosecution. Jackson was sorry because he had lost his clinic equity. He was sorry because his comfortable, subsidized reality had violently collapsed. He was not genuinely sorry for the 30 years I spent feeling like a ghost. Lingering hatred for him was absent. The burning anger had completely dissipated, replaced by a cool, clinical indifference. Recognizing him for exactly what he was, a compromised variable in life's code, brought clarity. A reply was drafted. Exclamation points were not used. Words of comfort were not offered, nor was the apology returned. The message was kept strictly transactional, exactly as our relationship had always been. Payment received and verified. The remaining balance has been updated in the shared ledger. Do not contact me outside of these monthly financial updates. Send was clicked. Closing the email application, engineering reports became the focus again. Hesitation did not exist. Guilt was nowhere to be found. Establishing a permanent boundary requires an immense amount of discipline, but the reward is absolute peace. Letting them live their lives in their small condo, while I lived mine in the sky, was perfectly fine. Their love was not needed to validate my existence. The heavy door remained closed. Driving the Porsche Cayenne out of the city as the late afternoon sun began its slow descent felt like a victory lap. The highway stretched out endlessly before me, winding through the lush, green landscapes just outside of Boston. rolling the windows down slightly. The crisp, rushing air filled the luxurious cabin. The engine hummed a deep, powerful note, responding instantly to the lightest touch of the accelerator. 30 years old. A phenomenal career, a beautiful home, and a philanthropic foundation actively changing lives. The cancer of my biological family was surgically excised, and every single piece of the future they tried to steal was reclaimed. As the sky shifted into brilliant shades of orange and bruised purple, the core lie so many are taught to believe surfaced in my thoughts. We are told our worth is determined by how much our parents love us. We are told that if the people who gave us life do not celebrate us, we must be inherently flawed. But blood only makes you related. It is your boundaries that make you free. Setting yourself on fire just to keep a toxic family warm is not a requirement. Accepting the role of the invisible child, the backup plan, or the silent ATM is a choice, not a life sentence. The moment you stop waiting for their validation is the exact moment your real life begins. They cannot erase you if you refuse to be written in pencil. Pressing the accelerator a little harder, the incredible surge of power pushed me back into the leather seat, driving toward a horizon that belonged entirely to me. The freezing blizzard was survived, the lies decoded, and a fortress built that no one could ever breach. Smiling, a genuine, quiet expression of pure victory crossed my face. The architect of my own destiny was finally at the wheel. If you have ever had to build your own closure, share this story. You are never invisible when you learn to see your own worth. Thank you for listening. I am finally completely free.